live.
A very good afternoon to everyone present. My name is Rohil Vedya, and I'm a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies. It gives me great pleasure to warmly welcome you to another ICS Wednesday seminar. Today's seminar is on China and the Saudi Arabia-Iran diplomatic rapprochement. Before we begin, a brief background on today's seminar. On the 6th of March this year, representatives from Iran and Saudi Arabia met in Beijing for diplomatic discussions, and 4 days later, on the 10th of March, Riyadh and Tehran announced the decision to normalize relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Both sides agreed to reopen their embassies and exchange ambassadors after 7 years of mutual tensions, animosity, proxy warfare, suspected attacks, and espionage. The fact that the deal was facilitated by China has been seen as yet another sign that China's diplomatic clout is growing in the region and across the globe. Today's conversation hopes to explore questions like how sustainable is this deal, how are other regional players responding to it, and how does the deal impact America's long-standing but waning dominance in the region. I shall now introduce the speaker and the chair for today's session. Today's speaker is Dr. Andrea Giselle. He is an assistant professor in the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Fudan University in Shanghai. He's also the head of research for Pro-China Hub's ChinaMed project. His research interests include Chinese foreign policy analysis, and China's relations with the Middle East. His book, Protecting China's Interests Overseas, Securitization and Foreign Policy, was published by Oxford University Press in 2021. Today's session will be chaired by Mr. Atul Aneja. He is the editor of India Narrative, a news website that looks to capture India's rise as an influential player on the global stage. He was formerly the strategic affairs editor at The Hindu and was posted in Beijing between 2014 and 2020 as associate editor China. He was also the West Asia correspondent for The Hindu and was based in Bahrain and Dubai from 2002 to 2014. In this period, Mr. Atul was a field reporter during the Arab Spring in Cairo, Benghazi, and Tunis. Specializing in conflict zones, he has also reported on the war in Lebanon in 2006 and covered the then emerging situation of the Anglo-American War in Iraq. His areas of interest are geopolitics, international security, and geoeconomics, with a focus on China and Eurasia. Before I hand the session over to the chair, a few housekeeping rules to keep in mind. All the participants should remain muted during the presentation. Questions can be posed in the chat box during the event and will be read out during the Q&A session. Or you can raise your hand to speak during the Q&A session after the presentation is over. Once called upon, please put your hand down, unmute yourself, and ask your question in a concise manner. With that in mind, I shall hand the session over to Mr. Atul Aneja to take over the proceedings. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you so much, Rohil. Real pleasure to be here speaking to a very erudite audience in ICS. The topic which has been chosen is of extreme relevance in a changing world, which I do believe is the cracks of the bipolar world. Have given rise to a multipolar era in which new countries have emerged. Especially, you have the rise of China, the rise of India, and you have other civilizational states and emerging economies showing their influence on the global stage. The unipolar world is behind us, but a new multipolar world with rules of stability has still not emerged. So we are in a fascinating kind of a stage of global transition, and here China comes in very, very prominently. I will come straight to the rise of China, and specifically to the 20th Party Congress, which has just been concluded. Now, this is an extremely major event where the Chinese president consolidates his power. China is focused, China is organized. But the question arises that while the rise of China is apparent, and the further rise of China also is visible, which direction will China take ideologically? Will it go to a peaceful era of a multipolar world where you have 5 or 6 major poles living in harmony, and where geopolitics gives way to collaboration and cooperation, with China being one of the major players? The US will be there, India comes in, we'll have Brazil, Africa, more probably South Africa, and the European Union. Will that be the case? or will China go back to the other extreme, I would put, of its so-called default position of viewing itself as the Middle Kingdom, where it is the core hegemon surrounded by tributary states. I mean, this is a concept of Middle Kingdom which goes back to the Zhou dynasty, first century. So will China be the new hegemon, and will in the process result in a situation of conflict between the Chinese and the Americans on one hand, where other countries get dragged into geopolitics and are forced to choose one side or the other? Is this going to be an era of Cold War before it settles into something which is stabler and lasting? Now, these are the questions which arise. And it is in this context when China has already declared its two centenary goals. That was in the 19th Party Congress with clear-cut timelines, which was the 2021, China becoming a moderately prosperous society, essentially meaning that extreme poverty will be eliminated. And then there are the other benchmarks by 2035, probably be the world's biggest economy, beating the Americans. And by 2049, marking 100 years of the formation of the PRC, or the People's Republic of China, that it will be the most important player on the global stage in all fields of human endeavor. I mean, the Chinese have declared that their roadmap to be the preeminent nation in the world. So that's where it comes in. Is the 20th Party Congress building up on the concepts of which were declared by President Xi Jinping at the 19th Party Congress? Along with that, there is the Boao Forum in 2022, the announcement of this Global Security Initiative, which clearly says that China has global initiatives. The Belt and Road Initiative is with us, which is again international in its vision. And that's the context within which this particular topic which we have chosen, China's intervention to draw two major hubs defining politics and geoeconomics in the West Asian Middle East, which is Iran and Saudi Arabia. Both countries are civilized. At least Iran says is a civilizational state. Saudi Arabia too says that it has a deep civilization. But because of the presence of the two holy mosques, it has a special appeal in the entire Muslim world. So that again are very two important sort of pivots in the Middle East and West Asia and Middle East, and where China has played in bringing them together. Now, what does it mean from here with the coming together of the Sunni world and the Shia world, if you look at it in an ideological sense? Is this also part of the larger multipolarity which we are seeing, where Iran and Saudi Arabia, etc., it's the Gulf itself is coming into another major pivot on the global stage? And again, the question, Rohil, which you raised, is how long will it last? Can Chinese, after their diplomatic intervention, in some way convert it into also a security, add a security dimension to it by coming into the Indian Ocean and the Gulf with their navies and with their military power? Will that lead to it? And if it does so, how is the West going to react to it, especially the United States going to react to it? Will there be an attempt at regime change in Iran and Saudi Arabia if the policies of these two countries take a direction, I think likely to do so, of strategic autonomy, defining their interests in their own terms? Will that mean an attempt to do that in both Iran and Saudi Arabia? And is it possible? Will that, in a way, bring in the nuclear question into place? Because to secure themselves, will these countries, with tacit support from, let's say, maybe from China, become nuclear power? So it has set in course a very, very clear dynamic. And will the Americans, for example, to counter China's influence globally, try to undermine them through Southeast Asia, through the Indo-Pacific route? And we will see where that goes, and weaken them from the maritime dimension, the maritime side, so that the global influence reduces. There are plenty of questions which come into play. And this particular deal is part of this much larger global process of dispersal of power in the global system and the chaotic global system that we see right now. And I think I'm not particularly envying Dr. Andre Geisel to wade into it and try and make sense of what possible directions can the Middle East take place after the advent and the diplomatic and a bold diplomatic intervention by a very strong and rising China. I think I'll stop here, and perhaps Dr. Geisel can go take it from here, and then we can keep the discussion alive as we go along. Rohil?
Okay, thanks a lot for the very kind introduction. First of all, let me thank the Institute for Chinese Studies for the kind invitation, its leadership, Ms. Konar in particular for contacting me, asking to join this event, and of course for a great chair, Mr. Aneja, for being part of the discussion. It's a great pleasure and a great honor. Unfortunately, I have to say that I'm not sure if I will be able to address all these big questions. As Ms. Vadia said earlier, one of my research interests is foreign policy analysis rather than international relations. As such, I tend to look really at the granular changes and the different factors behind those small changes rather than the big picture. Unfortunately, there are pros and cons in this approach. So I'll do my best to give my opinion, interpretation of the current events, and I think as Mr. Aneja said, we can continue that discussion with Q&A and of course also with the audience. So I'll try to make a few points. The first one is that this is definitely a golden moment for the relations between China and the Middle East. That's I think it is already becoming clear, I would say, in the past few years, but I think that this most recent tripartite agreement statement, between the Saudis, the Chinese, and the Iranians clearly shows that. But I think this is we should look at it and we should consider it as both a surprising and a non-surprising development, which and I'm not really sure yet which one of these two interpretations is the most convincing one. I think they both have something important to say and there's something important for us to keep in mind, but it will take some time. Maybe it's really know what will happen in the future. So the first thing, the surprising part, I remember clearly when I read the news about the statement being made in Beijing, I was personally extremely surprised. And being a bit familiar with the Chinese debate on the Middle East, at least at a scholarly level, of course, I'm not sure what diplomats and so far and so on think, but at a scholarly level, the first thing I thought, the first two things that I thought were, wow, this is surprising. And the second thing that I thought is, I'm sure that a lot of other people, Chinese scholars, also thought the same. Very few people, I think, had any idea of what was coming until they read the news. Interestingly, reported first, I believe, by the New York Times at the very beginning, rather than Chinese media, which is another interesting thing. But nonetheless, very surprising. Why is that? I think no one, if we think about the events of not the past few months, but going back to December, I think we had, of course, the 3 summits in Riyadh with Xi Jinping traveling there, a lot of important events, a lot of talks about discussions, meetings, and different level, of course, heads of state. And one of the things that really came out after this was this joint statement between GCC countries and China, in which they were mentioned the island disputed by Iran and the UAE, and that was somehow surprising, especially because it seemed like China was actually siding somehow, was somehow giving support to the Emirati side. Of course, and this was of course surprising given the nature of the relations between Beijing and Tehran. And so when later on it was announced that Raisi was coming to China, going to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping, I think many people thought it was somehow a natural move made by the Chinese somehow to to make up for the statement. And indeed, I think if you follow, I think also English language media reported it. At the Channel Project, we talked about it as well. Indeed, Iranian media were pretty angry. Iranian commentators were very angry about that. And so it seemed like a reactive move somehow that were inviting Raisi so to somehow say, tell the Iranians, it's all fine. We are not changing our position. We're still trying to keep distance from both sides and so on. So in a way, a reactive move. And then just a month later, we see this picture of Wang Yi together with the leaders of the two countries' delegations, holding hands and announcing this new agreement and the rapprochement of the between the Saudis and the Iranians. And it turns out that actually Raisi's visit to Beijing was instrumental, was part of the process. So suddenly that was not anymore a reactive move, something that maybe could expected in the past, but was more part of again, a process to reach a very important diplomatic result. So in a way, very surprising and unexpected, especially in that situation, I would say. At the same time, of course, I would say that there is a non-surprising element in all this story. That is the main reason why I say that this may be a golden moment. Maybe era sounds too long term, but at the very least a golden moment for the relation between China and the Middle East. And the thing is that I believe that at the moment, the interest between China and all the major players, or at least most of the major players in the Middle East and North Africa, are in great harmony, meaning that the two sides have to do very little adjustment to actually agree on many key issues. There's very little need, relatively speaking, for the two sides to make concessions to each other. There are, of course, some issues over which the two sides do not agree. Look at the much talked about FTA agreement between the JCC and China that I think it's almost 20 years long. Almost 20 years old negotiations. I think will be 20 years next year. So, and still, I don't think it's unlikely there will be much breakthrough. But nonetheless, so many elements, the two sides agree. And maybe this is particularly evident in the case of the Saudis and of course the Iranians. Indeed, it seems to me like reading from the news that are available, what we know about the process and the drivers of the different actors involved, it seems that on the one hand, the Iranians needed to somehow bring some, they needed a win somehow and to ease the tensions at home, especially in a moment of great fragility, political and economic and social fragility at home. For the Saudis, it has become, they realized essentially they were overstretched. And so it was important somehow to ease the tensions with neighboring countries. And of course, in a moment in which the government in Israel is not really going to be one that is much liked by the Arab public opinion, in comparison, relaxing the relations with Iran and somehow bringing an end to the war in Yemen. Now we hear talks about normalization between the Saudis and the Syrians. It's definitely another option, a very important option. And so in this way, also the Saudi leadership can focus more on economic development at home, the famous Vision 2030, for example. At the same time, if we look at China, I think Chinese commentators and experts, assuming that what they write reflect or mirror to some extent also the thinking in the government, they've been talking for a long time about a vision for the region that is not anymore focused on rivalries, but on economic development. The idea is that If you stop fighting each other and instead you start focusing on economic relations, then stability will be possible in the region. Also, it will be easier to eliminate, of course, external intervention, especially, of course, which is another way to say American intervention. We will all be able to do good and to do well at the same time. So from this point of view, again, if we look at, and I think, again, all these factors were there when the three sides, well, first between the Saudis and Iranians, I think it's important to keep in mind that it was not, what happened in Beijing was not the entire process, of course. There were many rounds of negotiations and talks in the past. So the two sides already were motivated to reach an agreement. And of course, the Chinese also probably were eager to do that. Again, changing the diplomatic narrative at the global level is one thing, especially after the very cold, let's say, so to say, cold reaction to China's position paper on Ukraine. So bringing home this success in the Middle East was important to change a bit the narrative, the global narrative on China's role in international affairs. Of course, it can open the door to new economic opportunities. It's also definitely a way to continue scoring points against the United States, especially we already saw that in December, right, with comparison everywhere between the purple carpet rolled for Xi Jinping and instead a much more low-key reception of Joe Biden earlier. I think it was August or July, in summer 2022 in any case. So many goals and opportunities, short-term, very short-term, medium-term, long-term goals that China could achieve. Same thing probably for also the Iranians and the Saudis. I would imagine that for the Saudis made sense to bring the Chinese in, as that's with the hope at the very least that although Chinese commentators are always very cautious in saying we do not have the influence to shape Iranians' decisions, but as long as as long as people outside think that, and probably the Saudis thought that with China being part of the agreement, the sunken cost for Tehran to let it fall apart would increase. That would, this is just, everything makes sense. And I think, this simple statement, this agreement and the general moves of these actors make sense. It's an important element to consider, especially in comparison then, to what, or the entire discussion, especially in the United States about, what are our priorities, right? The Indo-Pacific, the Middle East. Are we tired of the Middle East? And what should we do about Ukraine and so far and so on? So in the middle of, I think we should not really see this as a kind of fight for influence between China and the United States. I think here we have different dynamics. One is the United States trying to understand what are its priorities and how to allocate its diplomatic, economic, and military resources on the one hand, and then China instead seizing a great opportunity to achieve multiple goals. Now, looking at the future, I don't think that this agreement is likely to herald the beginning of a new era of Chinese ascendancy or primacy in the region. Again, because this was an important agreement, of course, between two sides that had and still have, because in reality the Saudis and the Iranians are not friends suddenly. They still have many issues, and so. But nonetheless, this was an agreement between sides that wanted to agree in the first place. And so, this was, I think, a crucial element. Of course, also on the Chinese side, the involvement of Xi Jinping probably brought many diplomatic and political resources that maybe that part of the Chinese foreign policy machine does not usually enjoy when it comes to new diplomatic initiatives. But if we look more long term, I think there are many factors that somehow we should consider. For example, if we think about China and the Middle East, I don't think it really makes sense for China to change its current approach, that is, focus on economic development, try to engage economically the region, and stay out unless really invited, and unless, like in this case, there is a really possible diplomatic win that can be made. I think if you read what Chinese experts usually write about their countries, Middle East policy, in general, they say, yes, the Middle East is important. We import a lot of oil from there. There are many other interests. Think about terrorism. The region is an important market for our companies and so far and so on. But none of our core interests are really threatened by anything coming from there. There are, yes, of course, the disruption of oil or the flow of oil can be extremely costly for us, but at the same time, it's extremely unlikely. And I think on this, there is an interesting agreement between Chinese and American analysts. And at the same time, we have already a lot of troubles with the United States in Asia. So from this point of view, we have to pick our battles, and we have to also choose where to invest our limited, what they call diplomatic resources. Watch out for the UN. And so the Middle East is not a priority from this point of view. I would say, and this again, I already said it other times, and some people agree, some people don't agree. But I think we can consider the Middle East as the most important among the least important regions in Chinese foreign policy. Again, very important, oil and so far and so on, but also not so important, especially in comparison to Asia, where competition with the United States is only growing, right? So I think this is an important factor to keep in mind, and it really doesn't play in the strength of China. China can, there is a lot of debate and actually a lot of scholarship on if and how the gap between China and the United States is closing or is enlarging or is stable. Different people use different measures, but it's quite clear, and the Chinese themselves acknowledge that the United States will remain the most important and most powerful, overall powerful country in the Middle East. Militarily, that's evident. Culturally, in terms of soft power on the elites, on the population, and so far and so on. Of course, with many limits, but that remains a fact. Russia is not going to take over it, of course, especially now. China also is either not interested or not capable of doing that. And so, from this point of view, for the Chinese, it only makes sense to be opportunistic, in a way, diplomatically opportunistic, and not overstretch. Keep trying to push for economic engagement. The region is already going in that direction. And I think in many ways, as I said earlier, I don't think many people outside the government in China expected this to happen. But at the same time, when people read the news, they were ecstatic because this was exactly what I've been talking and hoping for many years. And so in a way, this, my hope, and I think that this three-party statement would only confirm the correctness of that strategy rather than prompting a change. I think this is an important element to keep in mind. But of course, let's see what happens, especially how this agreement is implemented, its effect both in the two countries, Iran and Saudi Arabia, as well as in the region, whether the conflict in Yemen can really come to an end, whether also, let's see how the situation in Syria will also evolve. I think they've been talking about a new summit in Beijing with the Iranians and the Arabs. Let's see how that happens and what happens that day. That would be definitely an important milestone. I think they talk about it as a possible November event. So that will be an important milestone for sure. I would not, honestly, I would not expect China to act necessarily as the guarantor of the statement, in the sense that I'm sure they will put pressure on whoever, when they perceive that someone is not sticking to it. But I think that would be the limit, probably informal pressure maybe. But I would be very surprised if something more official, something more loud come out of Beijing. That would be another surprising development, but I don't think that it is very likely. So looking at the future, just the last point, I think at the moment, many Chinese experts are quite correct in thinking that time is on their side, on China's side, at least in the region. as again there is clear convergence of interest between the two sides, and increasingly less between the region and the United States. But again, that does not necessarily mean, I believe, that if and when there is a clash of interest, these two sides necessarily will find a way to negotiate and compromise, unless I think that would be much more difficult. Let's put it this way. But again, difficult to tell at this point. I tend to be cautious or over cautious in my predictions. I think it's not my job to predict, but I hope this can be good foundation for our discussion today. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, Dr. Kesali, nice.
Yeah.
Excellent presentation, and excellent presentation of a point of view, which was sharply articulated. So I think that sets the basis for a good discussion. I would start by saying that assumption or your assessment that China is likely to play a benign role. I don't know whether that word is correct, but not a non-aggressive role in the Middle East. I'm not sure that that is likely to be the case, not because of anything else, but because of certain facts on the ground. You see, if you see, China starts with one aircraft carrier, the Liaoning, taken from Ukraine, the Varyag Ukraine. Then is already on to 3. And by 2035, and talking of reports which have come out in Xinhua, no other places, Global Times, saying that by 2035, China wants to acquire 6 aircraft carriers. If you're going to have 6 aircraft carriers, you're not going to deploy it only in the Pacific. Once you have Taiwan, for example, and if you had the nuclear submarine in the Strait of Taiwan, then from there, the Chinese, that submarine can go anywhere, and no island chains of the Americans, etc., can detect where they're going. And you look at what's happening further into, you cross Indonesia, come to the Indian Ocean, and you have the Hambantota port of Sri Lanka in a way that can potentially be turned, because the control is with the Chinese. They have not done it as of now. And I agree that this may not be a short-term goal, but the capacities are being placed in the Indian Ocean as well. Djibouti is a base in the Horn of Africa. The Chinese Navy, under the cover of anti-piracy patrols, was sailing in these waters, acquiring data, information, which they've already sorted it out. So I do not see that. I've stayed China in 6 years. I know what they say, and the commentaries can be very pleasing. Community of shared destiny, win-win situation. But we got to just keep that away and look at facts on the ground, and perhaps they may at least give reason to another possibility that it may not be such a benign role. And I also think your second point, that oil is important, but I thought you were underplaying that. Energy is vital for China and its rise, and it will do anything to get reliable access to that energy. It's fine. The whole problem of Chinese is their Malacca trap. When the tankers come across the Strait of Hormuz and come towards Malacca Strait, that's where the Americans dominate. And they have been trying their ways to try and divert the oil somewhere. You had this debate of the Kra Peninsula from Thailand, but more importantly, CPEC from Gwadar. You take a pipeline up into Kashgar, and then from there you join the west-east pipeline systems, which get into Xinjiang and then towards Shanghai. That's another very, very important initiative from an energy perspective. And now with Iran, for example, Iran, Turkmenistan, and again you take it eastwards to the west-east pipelines, to Xinjiang, and then again to the energy heartland of the coast. So I think energy is the lifeblood of the Chinese, and if there is a threat, may not be now, but in the long term, I have very much my doubts that they will not militarily prepare to address it. So I think to look at that, the Chinese will not, and you and I know they think long and they think far, and the centenary goals are out there, and they're moving in a target-oriented approach. So I have somewhere not comfortable with this assumptions that Chinese will not make use of the opportunities they may have in Iran and in Saudi Arabia. I would not be surprised if they start looking at Chabahar, for example, as a basing area at some point in time. Now, it's another matter that Iranians may want it or not, because they are also a proud civilization. And, the Iranians keep saying, we will not tolerate a hegemon from the East or from the West. So it may not be but I don't think the Iranians may not want it, but Chinese not, it's not Chinese, to be honest. And both Iran and Saudi Arabia, perhaps it also, I think one factor was the Afghan situation, the way the Americans went out of Afghanistan, the reliance on, especially from Saudi point of view, on the Americans as a security guarantor also perhaps was a factor. They went to look around for various other options, strategic autonomy, not just to the Chinese. I mean, they move towards Europe, and with India, there are new things which are happening. So I think it's to assume a sanguine or a relatively placid situation may not be correct, because there are lots of undercurrents right now, which may surface sooner than later. That's just a few of my comments. My last one question for you, Selim. What is the deal? The Chinese may want oil from Iran and Saudi Arabia. What do the Saudi Arabians and Iranians want from China? Economic one. Is there something else? What is, because we talk of international relations, and it doesn't just happen. There is history shows that there are very, very fundamental demands from each side before you get into such a strategic deal. So what is the give and take between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and China? What does each get out of this? Thank you.
How should we?
Yes, Dr. Andre. I think you can take Ms. Ratul's questions first, and then we can go into the questions in the chat.
Just 1 second, then Rohil, then you will do the Q&A. You will do the coordination.
Yes, sir. I'll ask the questions, then we'll go ahead.
Great.
Okay, so thanks for the comments. I'll go backward from the last point, give and take, and then back to the others. Give and take, again, I think all the sides have something to gain out of this tripartite statement, and each of them especially gains something out of it because of the presence of the other two, in a way. I guess I don't claim to be an expert of Iranian or Saudi politics. Just what I understand, also talking with people that know a bit more than me on this issue. I believe that the Iranians out of this managed to gain to relax a bit their own regional environment at the very moment, especially again a moment of domestic fragility in the short term, and possibly also some economic opportunities in terms of Saudi investment in Iran. Maybe there was something, some of the things that appeared in the news at the very least. Some, I think, was Middle East Eye, a website specialized in the Middle East. They also reported that there were Chinese pressure on Iran on essentially toning down their regional diplomacy and somehow managed come to an agreement with the Saudis. I'm not, honestly, I heard different opinions about this source. Some say it's more just a rumor, some say it's reliable. So I'm not sure, but I believe that I will not be surprised if, of course, this agreement, since also pleases the Chinese, can also make it easier then for the Chinese also to provide support to Iran. And this brings me to the second part, what the Chinese gain out of it. Again, they definitely score in the short term important diplomatic points against the United States. They see the region going a bit more toward their own understanding, what they hope that can happen. And I want to be clear, I think I don't want to make normative judgments. So I'm not saying that it's a benign or aggressive, or I honestly don't think states are good or bad. I don't think there's any of that. I think, but that said, I believe that from the Chinese perspective, especially in terms of what are their interests and capabilities that they have in the region, it only makes sense for them to hope that the region can be more focused on economic development, because of course that also plays on their own strength, right? Can only be a bigger market for their companies, for example. It also diminishes the risk for their own citizens and workers in the region, of course. Stability is also good for terrorism. And in general, they've always thought, and this is very is over the decades, they have always said, stability in the Gulf also depends on the integration of Iran in the region. From a diplomatic perspective, Iran cannot be isolated. This is important for regional stability, and of course, again, it further erodes American influence in the region. Economically, I'm not, again, I imagine that they look at this through the lens of regional stability, and that bring in more opportunities, or at least decreasing the risks associated with investing, operating in the region. As to the Saudis, again, the agreement per se with the Iranians helps to diminish the tensions in their own neighborhood, especially Yemen in the first place. It helps going to that direction, especially after the overstretching that they've been suffering. It also, of course, decreases the risk of Iranian attacks directly on oil facilities. Generally speaking, it helps to cool down the situation in the region, allowing them to focus on what it seems to be the main goal of the current leadership, Saudi leadership, that is domestic economic development. So that definitely is something. Now, bringing the Chinese in the part of the agreement is an extra, because I would not be surprised if part of the calculations that people made in Riyadh was that if the Chinese are part of this, and they will have a stake, and that will also create a possibility maybe that if the Iranians decide not to stick to the agreement, the Chinese will help us to keep the Iranians in line, at the very least. So, maybe that will not happen, but if there is this possibility, why not creating it, right? So, long story short, I think they all have something to gain for very little in exchange to give to some extent, as they all see. I think they all see very important and a multiple number of goals at reach. Maybe not necessarily tomorrow, but some of them tomorrow, others next week, and over the time. Of course, I don't think no one in Tehran, in Riyadh or Beijing is naive to think that there are no risks of everything falling apart. But at the very least, it creates a new possibilities. At the very least. Now, going to the issue of oil. I always found talking about oil difficult because it's actually a highly technical matter. So my assessment on the risk of the actual risks of disruption of oil and so far and so on comes from what I read about both reports written by American scholars as well as Chinese scholars. And in general, it seems to me there is an agreement that serious disruption, and for that I mean like literally oil stopping coming to China for a long period of time, so not just a fluctuation in the price, but even historically recent episodes of instability in the region have not really shaped oil prices at all, but nonetheless it would be something that like serious disruption of oil could only take place essentially in two key scenarios. One is a regional actor manages to become an hegemonic regional player. So essentially, but even including, in a way, extending its influence to the extent of controlling the oil production of also other countries. And so having the capability of just stopping it, and that would be definitely an issue. Or you have essentially a naval blockade. That's another possibility. But it seems to me, and this is I know this is part of a discussion. There are especially 3 articles. Later, I can try to find them and share the link here in the chat box, in which essentially there is the idea that a naval blockade to to stop the oil from flowing towards China is tactically appealing but strategically flawed, in the sense that it would require a massive amount of naval resources on the American side that would essentially impede then the use of those resources to do other things. And still, the actual success rate of such a massive, even investing the maximum amount of resources, would still be not necessarily a complete blockade. But of course, the question is, once you do that, probably war is already going on elsewhere at this point. So long story short, I think if it comes to, if we eliminate the possibility of a regional hegemon deciding to blackmail China, and at this point the world probably not refusing to ship oil, I think that the issue of blockade becomes somehow paradoxical of a second concern, given all the implications, the scenario in which something like that would take place, right? And so in a world in which policymakers have, like us, 24 hours every day, many domestic issues, many diplomatic priorities to take care in one single day, they cannot essentially keep on warring on that every single moment. So again, I'm not denying the importance of oil. It's definitely an important fact. It's an important economic fact. But the question is it, under what circumstances these energy factor would become something to trigger something that is more than a diplomatic intervention, but as you said, a military one. I think that's a very important question, and I think there are very limited number of scenarios in which that could happen. One of which being war already going on probably, and at this point the embargo would be probably a second an issue of second concern with war going on in Asia. So the aircraft carriers, then, this is a very good point, and again, it's a terrific point. Something that, of course, aircraft carriers they're meant to be sent somewhere, right? They cannot stay in a lake and circle, especially when you have 6 and they're big toys, right? You need a place where to send them. So that's definitely an issue. I tend to be, that said, I tend to focus on the things that I know and that I can somehow try to predict. So I'm not negating alternative scenarios. I'm just saying that at the moment, if I were, and I'm not claiming that Chinese policymakers think the same way that I do, but I think at the moment, with all the things going on around the world, the very thorny issue of Ukraine, how to manage the relations with Europeans, the Russians and Ukrainians, Taiwan, the United States, and so far and so on. I think at the moment, thinking about a change in a strategy that seems bearing fruits, increasingly important fruits in the Middle East, I don't think it would make much sense. Maybe in the future. And of course, there is the base in Djibouti. That's a very important thing. That said, I don't think that Djibouti is necessarily the first of many, or at least of big official bases. I think if you look at the factors that most likely drove Chinese thinking about Djibouti, we see that a country in which there are already other bases, on which both the MFA and the PLA could agree on. There are not many places around the world that fit the same description. And of course, you mentioned the port in Sri Lanka. I guess many people have read also some of the recent publications on ports, especially I'm thinking about the work of Isaac Cardon, for example, in international security, and his co-author. But I think, and it's also interesting, there's been a bit of back and forth on that journal between the authors of that paper, as well as scholars at the Naval War College. And it seems to me that one of the things that the two sides agree on, and that I also agree on, those Chinese invested facilities do allow some measure of power projection, of course, but we should never underestimate the role of the local agency, the role of host governments, especially then if we think about something that is not, let's say, projecting power in peacetime, let's say, special forces to raid, a terrorist camp that kidnap one of your citizens, something like that. If we think in a more kind of classic power projection kind of way, in which there is the United States and its allies putting pressure on all the possible countries that could help China, I think the scenarios change quite a bit. And I think this is also a point that is made by those scholars. And honestly, I agree to a large extent. So I'm not saying that this is a solution to your question, what about those 6 or 7 carriers? I don't claim that I have that. But at the same time, I think, a kind of sometimes 2035 or 2049, I think it's 2049, the goal of achieving a first-class military. Sometimes it feels it's gonna be tomorrow, but also it feels a lot of things can happen until then. Some of which might speed up this process, some of which can also slow it down. Especially, I would say, in this very uncertain, unfortunately, very uncertain, scenario at the global level. And so, yeah, one final point, because this is an issue that I'm very, the idea that there is a long-term planning. I think, I don't know. I know, of course, this is one of the main points of view, especially, let's say, if we think about, let's say, The Long Game, Rush Doshi's recent book. But I believe there are also other scholars, in which I include myself, that are a bit more skeptical of all this planning going on the Chinese side, especially then if we consider then implementation and then possible changes. And of course, plans can change. But nonetheless, I'll stop here. Of course, we can continue this discussion. Although I really think that the planning against adaptation and so on is almost a more philosophical one, since neither of us has access to Chinese policymakers at the moment.
Okay, so our first question is from Mr. Shubhadeep Mandal. Shubhadeep?
Thank you, Roel. Thank you, Dr. Adre, for the enlightening session. I have 3 questions in particular. First thing, as you mentioned about you are a policy researcher, so I just wanted to know the changes that we see in the Saudi Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's recent policies or negotiation with the other countries. Do you see as a change from the orthodox approach of their policy under MSB, or do you think is a pragmatic approach what the situation unfolded after the US exit from the Afghanistan? That's the first question. Second question is that do you see that this kind of a relation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, will there be an economic implication for Iran, like opening up the economy or moving away from the US sanction or something of some sort of? And the third and last question would be regarding JCPOA. Given that the China is a member of the P5 plus country that are trying to negotiate the new deal, and given that the JCPOA is about to have a natural die by 2025, so do you think there could be any possibility of some similar changes or some type of a deal where US is not a part, but China makes a bigger role? Thank you.
Rohit, you want me to answer first?
Yeah,
or
so
want to collect?
You can, I think, answer them as they come in. So we'll go
Okay.
back.
All right. I will do the same that I did before. I would start backward. Also, because honestly, as I said, I'm not an expert on Iranian or Saudi politics, so I'm not really sure about the answer to the first question, especially the first. Then JCPOA, I think that's a very important question. I tend to be cautious. I do not think that an alternative agreement is that likely to emerge, although I think China would like it to see it. And I say this, and again, maybe people in the audience, probably Mr. Aneja will also think I'm naive, but I think it's important to keep in mind a lot of times. It's some of the comments made by Chinese experts on Russia, not on the United States, on Russia, especially the Astana process to deal with the Syrian issue, I think are quite interesting, in the sense that one of the things they say is that, you know, every chance of dialogue is good in theory. However, the reality on the ground is that no regional order or no big agreement in the region can be reached without also involving Western countries. And I don't think this is a way of describing things just for the sake of, you know, sounding cooperative. I think it grows out of, you know, a much more pragmatic and practical assessment of the fact that, you know, Western countries not only have a stake in the region, but also have a lot of ways to interfere what was going on there for the good or for the bad. And as such, any attempt to kind of reach a long-lasting agreement needs somehow their, if we don't want to say participation, at the very least some kind of assent. In any case, there are a lot of veto players in the region, whether China likes it or not. And I think this is one of the implicit criticism made to Russia from this point of view, as you know, the creation of an alternative peace process that does not include Western countries. So again, I don't think it's about being naive. I think simply about consideration of the fact, not of what people would like it to be. Going back again to your question about the JCPOA, I'm not sure, because I don't think that the Chinese would like, well, first of all, I'm not sure if there is the political appetite to take on such a big role, because one thing is being part of a three-party statement between, you know, between parties that want to agree. Another thing, and in which there is no like enforcing mechanism and nothing like that. Something akin to the JCPOA would be much more, you know, would be a completely different beast. A beast that needs to be tamed and needs to be controlled over time. And the question is, who wants to do that, right? There are so many variables on both in Iran, China, and all the, of course, China, you know, needs to, in any case, to, I don't think they're going to, you know, to drop their you know, their requirement, implicit requirement often for regional consensus on such kind of issues. So what will the Israeli do? What will maybe, you know, maybe, you know, the Saudis are fine with the rapprochement with the Iranians, but, you know, would they agree on China brokered agreement on the nuclear issue, a much more, I would say, vital and survival related issue? I'm not sure. I'm just saying that I think there are many possible obstacles to something like that to happen. Sorry, could you repeat the second question? I remember was the economic benefits.
Yeah. So my second question was that, due to this deal, is there any possibility that the economic condition of the Iran would be a better one in the coming time?
So I remember reading the news, and I think there were Saudi's officials discussing the possibility of some kind of mission to Iran or talks with Iran for investment. I'm sure that would be a very powerful carrot for Tehran in this moment, something that they would definitely like. I would not be surprised if, you know, a more favorable regional environment also could make China a bit more you know, willing then to support Iran, because I think it's important to say, I think from Chinese perspective, they of course they want to support Iran, but at the same time there are also limits to their, because not to the sacrifice of the other of their own interest in the region. So in the moment in which supporting Iran creates less damage to other relations, then maybe that can also make things a bit easier. But what I understand is that at the moment, many of the Iranian complaints about trade with China are not really, are not necessarily. It's not something that China can address. They can only be changed with Iran expanding its trade relations with other countries. So it will not be about China doing something, but it will be Iran engaging with more regional actors, diversifying its sources of imports, especially, and actually, but mostly import. So somehow to decrease their own reliance on China.
Thank you, sir.
The next question is, I'm sorry,
Rohil, before you go to the next one, just one quick thing I want to make to Mr. Mondal's question. I think it's interesting regarding the investments, Saudi investments in Iran. I think we got to broaden the picture here. May not be direct, but what's interestingly happening is the Iranians are just a shade away from joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the Saudis have shown interest in joining SCO. So if that happens, then trade investment can probably take place through the SCO route. Chinese investment coming in, and then investments coming from Saudi to China, things like that. But I think that framework has to also be factored in. That trade and commerce may also come through this other multilateral kind of a route where Saudis and Iranians are partners. And also the very fact that Iran and Saudis are going to join the SCO also is indication that come what may, there is a geopolitical competition here going on to co-opt, that is China and Russia being the main granddads of SCO, to co-opt Russia and China from frameworks which are outside the Western frameworks. I think that interplay is also going on. So that's my brief comment. Thank
you. The next question is from Megha Manoj. Megha?
Yes, am I audible, Rohan?
Yes, we can audible.
Okay. Thank you, panelists, and thank you. Special thanks to Mr. Andre for the lecture. So my question is, since the rapprochement deal, or since this tripartite deal has come into scene, what is the stand of both the countries, in like Iran and Saudi Arabia, in terms of the Xinjiang issue? Because Iran claims to be a civilizational state, and Saudi claims to be a very important protector of all Muslims in the world. So the Xinjiang issue, in the Xinjiang, there is the scenario itself is completely different. There is a huge strike against the Muslims and by the Han Chinese. So what is the stand in terms of that issue from both the states? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks. I think this is a very important question. And just to be sure, I would refer to you to the work of some of other scholars, such as Mohammed al-Sudairi and others. My understanding on the domestic drivers of the attitude of Iran and the Saudis, that mostly the Saudis, what I understand, it has to do with a broader shift that has taken place, not just in Saudi Arabia, but throughout the region, changing the balance of power between state and religious institutions, something that especially taken place, I would say, I guess, since the Arab Spring, late and the early 2010s, essentially the entire suppression of the Muslim Brotherhood, more broadly. And so I think there are maybe scholars like Amjad Rashid in the UK, showing that, for example, different countries, including Egypt, probably also in Saudi Arabia, have been, for example, actually, or in Syria, have been very supportive, for example, of Chinese Xinjiang policies. And this not out of attempts to gain, to score diplomatic points, but also because they see those policies and the idea of fighting religious extremism as matching with their own domestic interests. So I think it's important, again, as I mentioned earlier, no expert on regional politics per se. So this is why I would refer to other scholars that are a bit more knowledgeable about this. But when they understand, it's important, really important, to keep such kind of shift in how state institutions have changed the relationship with religious ones, including in Saudi Arabia, in which the state has become much stronger in this regard.
Thank you so much.
Our next question is from Ambassador Ashok Kanta. Sir.
Thank you, Shubdeep. Rohil. First of all, let me compliment Dr. Ghazali and Atul Aneja for the insightful remarks. I have a couple of questions. My first question is on significance of China mediating between Saudi Arabia and Iran to facilitate resumption of diplomatic relations between them, and whether it presages a larger mediatory role by China in other crisis situations as well. There are some people who argued that what has happened in case of Saudi Arabia and Iran, though it has got a lot of attention, was really a case of low-hanging fruits. You had these two countries who had diplomatic relations until 7 years ago. For last 5-6 years, they were in touch to resume diplomatic relations. Iraq did try to mediate, but didn't have the bandwidth or clout to facilitate that. And China sort of intervened at the right time, partly to address contradictions it was facing in developing relations with both Iran and Saudi Arabia simultaneously. You'll recall that in March 2021, when China entered into this 25-year agreement with Iran, there were a lot of concerns in Saudi Arabia. And likewise, following Xi Jinping's visit to Riyadh in December last year and joint statements he had with Saudi Arabia and GCC countries, there were misgivings and concerns in Iran. So these are two important partners for China by ensuring that they are back as diplomatic partners. They are diplomatic links. China was partly trying to address that conundrum. So first, I would like you to, both Atul and Dr. Ghazali, to comment on how significant China's role is. And secondly, does it presage a larger role by China elsewhere? And here I would like to point out that this was not China's diplomatic debut as a mediator. It has made several efforts in the past, virtually all of them unsuccessful, including in Sudan, Horn of Africa, Afghanistan, six-party talks on North Korea. In none of those situations, it could really bring about a breakthrough. So what has happened in case of Saudi Arabia and Iran, in a way, is a new development. I would like your comment on significance of that development and whether it could lead to China playing similar role elsewhere. My second question is related to what Atul mentioned earlier, that we need to look at China's foray in Middle East, not in narrow terms, but as part of its larger objective or grand strategy of emerging as a preeminent power by 2049. I mean, they have not kept it any secret. and they see Middle East. I will not agree that Middle East is most important among less important theaters for China. Actually, Middle East is a very important theater for China for a variety of reasons, including the fact that it's apart from Russia and Central Asia, it's the primary source for hydrocarbon resources for China. And also, in terms of its ambitions in geopolitical arena, it is an important theater. Part of the logic behind Gwadar Port also is to get access to this part of the world. How do you see China-US strategic contestation in Middle East and Gulf playing out? It's true that China is seeing an opening there. USA had sort of reduced its footprint there post withdrawal from Afghanistan. There are concerns about US commitment to the Middle East and Gulf. But at the same time, fact remains that the USA is by far the principal net provider of security in that region. In Saudi Arabia alone, the USA has 5 military bases. So China is nowhere close to reaching that situation. So, underestimating US clout or influence or interest in that region perhaps will be a mistake. Though fact remains that this region economically has become little less important in terms of hydrocarbon resources, because USA itself has become a surplus country in oil and gas. So I would like to have your sort of comments on unfolding geopolitical contestation between China and USA, and whether what has happened is a sort of pointer to China playing a larger role there. And this is for both Atul and Dr. Ghazali.
Who wants to go first?
Dr. Ghazali, you first, and then I'll follow.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Right. So great. So many thanks for the 2 excellent questions. Ambassador, right? Kanta, yeah. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. As to the first point, I at the moment, maybe facts will prove me wrong in a few months or in December or maybe next year. I still think that this was I belong to the group of those who see this as a low-hanging fruit somehow, in comparison to other crises going on around the world. I actually was just talking this afternoon about this with the Chinese colleague and thinking, maybe the Palestinian issue could be next or what else. And we couldn't really agree on the future. I think the conditions behind China's successful mediation in this case are pretty unique. There is this very good paper written by a colleague of mine, Sundegan, and Yahya Zobir, another excellent scholar based in France, on China's quasi-mediation in the Middle East, which essentially all these 5 or 4 or 6 point plans that do not really require, that they really do not have a clear follow-up. And you mentioned Afghanistan. North Korea maybe I think it's a bit of a different case, but with the 6 part, but definitely I think all the other attempts of mediations, I think they involve not just, of course, there is an issue of what kind of capacity and capability and political resources that China can bring to the discussion. I don't think China has ever brought the maximum of its weight. But that said, also I think they're all very thorny and difficult issues. In comparison, that was not necessarily the case this time. So I do think it was a low-hanging fruit, but I would not expect this to be necessarily the first of many in the future, or not in any case in the foreseeable or short-term future. As to the possible evolution of Sino-US relations in the Middle East, I think both sides are kind of trying to understand that. On the Chinese side, it seems to me that for a while, the Middle East was seen as a place in which some sort of cooperation with the United States was possible and desirable in order somehow to attenuate a bit the tensions in Asia. So it's kind of trying to balance a bit, adding a bit of cooperation in an otherwise much more competitive relationship. But I think that that vision has changed, especially in recent years. I would say, especially since the Biden administration, with the realization that U.S.-China policy under Biden has not changed significantly, in comparison with that of the Trump administration. And so I think there is a growing concern of a kind of Middle East Indo-Pacific strategy that the United States will adopt in order not anymore to preserve, because I think in the past it was the interpretation was the United States as a Asia or Indo-Pacific strategy to contain China, and then a Middle East strategy to preserve its order, its hegemony, and protect its interest there. Now I think the idea is that the United States will also try to contain China in the Middle East. So that has become the main US interest in the Middle East, so to have a sort of connected strategy. Now, how can China react to that? I think there is no consensus about what to do about it. I think at the moment, trying to score these kind of important diplomatic points through, this agreement, for example, is at the very least, the basic consensus. So when there is a possibility, why not trying to seize the opportunity? As to the United States, I'm not sure. It seems to me there are so many voices about what to do in the Middle East in Washington. Is it still a vital region? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. We sacrifice so much, but how much resources can we invest in it? There is, I think, a very important article was published recently, Middle East Policy, in which the author documented how actually, for example, the American military presence in the Arabian Peninsula has actually increased over the past years, despite all the talks about pivot to Asia and so far and so on. So, what's the how that is going to play? It's possible that this is a competition that might play out on parallel levels. On the one hand, the United States continuing, preserving a security-centered approach to the region, and China maybe continue with a more diplomatic and especially economic-centered approach to the region. And in this case, you would have countries, as they are trying to do now, right, maximizing the protection that can extract from the Americans, and at the same time doing their best, of course, to diversify the relations, the economic relations, especially bringing China in. How sustainable this is, I think it's a very difficult diplomatic dance, the one that countries in the region are playing. So, yeah, I'll stop here.
Ashok, just to come to your basic question about whether this will be the last initiative, or is this going to be a trend from the Chinese side? That is mediation between the Saudis and the Iranians. I don't think it's the last, because China is in a different dynamic right now. A rising China, for example, for my core analysis here is that China is looking for resources for its rise, and it is going to mediate, play active diplomatic role in those geographies where it can benefit from resources. And so therefore, oil and gas, very important. It's not surprising that they've gone into this theater of Iran and Saudi Arabia. I mean, the largest producers of oil in the world, and critical importance of oil deficient China. We all know the oil reserve in Xinjiang, etc. It's just hardly sufficient in the Tarim Basin, etc. for China's long-term needs. So I think they are going into those geographies from where they can get and assure resources. And that, to me, makes perfect sense when you go into Iran. And I will not be surprised if they go further into Africa. You mentioned, Ashok, about South Sudan and Sudan. And that's, again, really up Chinese alley. It's against oil in South Sudan. investments from China which have got into that area. And geopolitically, a former government which was friendly to China. So it made all sense to intervene in South Sudan. I would not be surprised in a conflict situation like Angola, for example. Great reserves of lithium. It's absolutely logical for Chinese to expand their influence. And the best way is to go the Chinese benign way, as peacemakers, as people who want to do good to humanity. I mean, that's a cover which they will always take. I will also not be surprised if at some point they will get into Afghanistan. Afghanistan, massive reserves. And again, for the electric car revolution, which China is already a leader, you need those massive reserves, despite the fact that China itself has critical minerals within the Chinese boundaries. But the ambition is so great that it will probably go into that. And I think they've already planned for it under this global security initiative, which is again to bring peace to conflict areas, etc., etc. But I think a diplomatic instrumentality has been created to enter these theaters big time. Because again, Ashok, what you said, 20, 30, 35, 49, these are clear-cut goals. And Chinese Communist Party is determined to achieve these goals. And they have demonstrated in the past how the hunt and thirst for resources. And this would be the case. But again, the benign cover will have to come in. They would not want conflict in certain areas, quite genuinely, from where you get your resources. Now look at CPEC, for example. And the Dawn had published this report by NDRC. It was supposed to be a semi-secret document. Now, if you see that, the blueprint for Pakistan from the Chinese perspective was take over every damn thing. I mean, you see the agriculture investments which Chinese wanted to make in Pakistan, right from power plants to agriculture, the game was completely hegemonic. I mean, and that document is still available on the Dawn website. I don't see that model changing, whether it is Pakistan or whether at some point it will come to Iran. Whether Iran will accept it or not, that's different. But the attempt is very, very clear. The rise of China, by whatever it takes, that level of commitment and political will cannot be underestimated. And I think they will use the best beauty of China is to think holistically with the core objective of their rise. I think then pieces, your diplomacy, security, all fall into place to achieve a common objective and they synergize that together. And hats off to the Chinese for thinking that way. As far as the United States is going, Ashok, I think what's happened now is that given the economic decline of the US, it's not still what it was when Soviet Union collapsed in 91. I mean, it was unipolar world. That's sharply deteriorating. And 2007, 8, we have seen those pivotal moments which demonstrate the growing weakness. Having said that, the Americans are an extremely powerful economy, but it is not the same. So I think they will choose theaters. Holistically, I agree with Dr. Gheseli that they were going to look at an integrated Indo-Pacific way. But within that arc, I think more important right now is to contain China in the Indo-Pacific, which essentially means driving your resources into AUKUS, that is Australia, UK, what else? US, of course. That is the core organization which has come in. Nuclear submarines coming into Australia now. The first Los Angeles class will come in, then later on the indigenous ones. So the resources are being put into that theater. And right now, when your kitty is shrinking, then you will put probably less in the Middle East right now. But I think there may be a point if China becomes more and more influential, whether bilaterally or through other multilaterally, through a SEO route or whatever way, and also starts to flex its military muscle through its string of bases in the Indian Ocean, I think there may be a repivot again at that point of time. And if the American economy for some reason picks up, then more likely that they will revisit the Middle East theater with as much intensity as they did earlier. The final point is who is the president of the United States? I think this is very, very important because if you have a Trump coming in, Trump and Pompeo were a team which actually wanted regime change and the collapse of the Communist Party of China. And that was the direction they were moving. But with Biden coming in and the Democrats coming in, it's more of managing relations with China with a leg up. And that is how, whether it's coming to this situation in Taiwan right now, you will show you demonstrate your military muscle, but nobody has the gumption to actually go for war, especially if it's a case of the Democrats and Biden and co. I think the third thing is another thing which dissuades war between China and the US, of course, is the nukes which have come in. That's a new dimension which were not there earlier in some of when it came to Iraq or some other regime change military interventions. So I don't think that will go to that level, but resources are going more in this direction towards the Indo-Pacific, east of the Malacca, rather than the west of it. But they can come back. These are more, and Americans think holistically and in an integrated manner. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for this answer.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, we are running a bit short on time. So what I'll do is I will edit the questions a little, and I will also request the answers to be very short, quick. So the next question is from Jaideep Gargi, who's watching on YouTube. He asks, OPEC, it seems, is regulating its oil output, keeping the Chinese economy in mind. Is China the most principal power in the region for the present and the future, given the Chinese infrastructural investment here? This isn't addressed to anyone in particular, so I think
Sorry, could you repeat it? I think the audio was a bit.
Of course,
good.
The OPEC, it seems, is regulating its oil output, keeping the Chinese economy in mind. Is China the most principal power in the region for the present and the future, given the Chinese infrastructural investment here?
Sorry, I'm really not sure if I understand the question.
In short, I believe they're asking if China is the principal power in the Middle East now, and the regulation of the oil output by the OPEC is an indication of how much influence Chinese infrastructural investment has in the Middle East now.
I'm not sure. I think the OPEC countries regulate their output based on their own interest. I would expect that definitely how that is going to affect Chinese purchase of oil is part of those considerations. I'm not sure if it's about Chinese investment per se in infrastructure in the region, but definitely it's about. But I would imagine that expectation about Chinese demand are part of that. I would expect. I believe. Yeah.
Our next question is from Colonel Roy. He asks if China can graduate to become the main mediator for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and replace the US, because Tehran has considerable influence with the Hezbollah in South Lebanon, and Riyadh has significant influence with Hamas in Gaza and West Bank. So if China can position itself to raise its game in the future and play an active role in resolving the pending conflict, or resolve it even partially.
Just my 2 cents on this. I think it's theoretically I don't think can be totally excluded, but in practice, I think it depends a lot on the Israeli government, and also related to that also on the actions of the United States. I don't think at the moment China can do much because, well, again, because its relations with Iran, and especially now with this rapprochement that it helped to mediate. Maybe in the future, but I don't think that this tripartite statement is part of, is going to make China significantly more willing or capable of solving the issue, honestly.
Yeah, I'd just like to add here, I don't think the Chinese are really interested in the Israel-Palestine issue. What they would be interested in the Israel-Iran issue, because that Iran is vital there, and stability of Iran is important. I mean, and also to make sure, so there are various reasons why, I mean, we don't have to go into that, we've discussed it, why Iran is important to the Chinese. So that particular activism makes sense for the Chinese. But I don't think it really matters to them. Really, it doesn't hurt any of the critical interests, the feud between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
The next questions were from Abu Zafar and Amit Dogra, but since they were on Xinjiang, I will skip them and they've been answered already. The last question is from Mr. Albert, who asks, how do you see efforts made by Chinese diplomats in the Middle East, particularly in those countries that have infrastructure ready for facilitating China, in a leap forward to lead the fourth industrial revolution vis-a-vis the US engagement in the same?
I think you already start to see, I think there is a great interest on both sides to push the economic relations between, beyond oil. Some time ago, right, the Chinese used to frame their approach to the Middle East as 1 + 2 + 3. So the first one was oil, and then you had other economic sectors of cooperation, of course, including renewable energies, nuclear, and so far and so on. I think more broadly, that's what they would like to see. And I think at this point, also many countries in the region are also interested in going beyond simply being oil suppliers. The real question is how that will, how that will happen, taking into consideration American influence, with essentially American officials being quite explicit on either you want us to cooperate with you on security and military issues, or you buy Chinese technologies. I think this is a point that is made increasingly clear by American officials and acknowledged also by Chinese diplomats. So I think that the question, that's really the question, I think. I'm sure there's willing on both sides, Chinese and region side, but to change, to adapt the relations to the changes of the global economy and technology. But there is an American issue there. I'm not sure how that will work, at least in the short term.
Any points, Mr. Apple, for the same? Okay then. Right. So with that, we have come. Right. With that, we have come to the end of today's seminar. I would like to thank Dr. Andrea Ghiselli and Mr. Atul Aneja for taking the time out of their busy schedules and holding a highly engaging conversation for all present. The diverse opinions conveyed made for a greatly enriching discussion on the Iran-Saudi-China deal. A video recording of today's discussion will be available on the ICS's YouTube platform. We would also like to invite everyone to next week's Wednesday seminar on Liang He 2023, China's Two Sessions, with Drs. G. Venkatraman, Rajiv Ranjan, and Bhimbi Subba. At the ICS, we have been conducting seminars every Wednesday for 4 decades, and more information for the same can be found on the ICS website and our social media pages. You can also follow our Twitter page and subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohel. Thanks a lot. And thank you, ICS, for having me.
Likewise. Thanks a lot for the invitation and for the great discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Atul, and thank you, Dr. Ghiselli. It was really great having you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.